Thank you to Urata-san for that warm welcome and introduction, and to Yoshida-san for really setting the scene for our discussion on the panel today with your thoughtful remarks. So I'm Shiro Armstrong. I'm a visiting fellow here at RIETI, but also from the ANU. It's a great pleasure to be back doing another event with RIETI. These are always a big highlight for me and really help with my thinking. And I hope it's the same for others as well, as we look at really challenging issues across the region, and in this case, how the region can contribute to really the global economic order. And we chose this topic and this theme because of the deep interdependencies in this part of the world, the complex supply chains that really depend on this open, rules-based economic order more than anywhere else in the world. So a breakdown in that system, in confidence in multilateral rules, will damage these economies, Japan, Australia, China, Southeast Asia, this part of the world, more than any other region in the world. And this is a growth center, as Urata-san said, a growth center of the global economy. Really dynamic economies in Southeast Asia, but also, of course, China. And they're causing major challenges for the regional economy, the shift in structure of trade, but also power. But they're also causing big challenges for the multilateral system. So progress in this part of the world, and progress in cooperation and rulemaking, can really contribute to the global order. So they're the sorts of issues I think we want to think through. And we're lucky we have an all-star cast to help us think through these issues. And I've asked them to stay to 7 minutes each, so we have plenty of time for discussions. I can see questions coming in already. So enough from me for now, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker to give us a presentation, Rebecca Santa Maria, who's the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat in Singapore, but of course previous to that was a senior Malaysian trade official. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Urata-san, Yoshida-san, my friend Peter Drysdale. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking RIETI and the ANU for this invitation to be here and to share the stage with this very impressive group of academics. I'm here as a policy maker who had a role in the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprints of 2015 and 2025. The operative word here is community. In the ASEAN Charter, signed in 2007, ASEAN saw itself on course towards, and I quote, one vision, one identity, one caring and sharing community. Yet the Charter reinforced the structure of ASEAN into 3 pillars or communities. I'll come back to this in a bit. My focus today is on answering the question, whither ASEAN centrality? The notion of ASEAN centrality is affirmed in the Charter, the ASEAN Charter. It calls for members, and I quote, to maintain the centrality and proactive role of ASEAN as the primary driving force in its relations and cooperation with its external partners in a regional architecture that is open, transparent, and inclusive, close quotes. I want to specifically draw attention to the words centrality and proactive. Politically, ASEAN centrality, or the ASEAN way, is how the region addresses challenges, the fundamental importance being the principles of sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, consensus, and unity. Has this worked for the grouping? Yes and no. For example, the trust that was gradually built between ASEAN and Myanmar enabled ASEAN to serve as a bridge for humanitarian support when Cyclone Nargis hit Myanmar in 2008. But the same ASEAN way has also led the region to refrain from imposing sanctions that could pressure the junta from resolving problems following the Myanmar coup in 2021. Critics are quick to point out that ASEAN, as a collective voice, should be more assertive in dealing with members that violate human rights. On the economic front, or the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, ASEAN's centrality is seen in its leadership in bringing Australia, China, Korea, Japan, and New Zealand in RCEP, arguably the world's largest FTA by GDP coverage, and a grouping that was the first to successfully involve China, Korea, and Japan. So, centrality, you can check that. However, ASEAN's record is less impressive when we consider proactive. Consider ASEAN's role at the WTO. Where is ASEAN's collective voice in the joint statement initiatives, in the work on environmental goods, and various other aspects of WTO reform? On the other hand, given that ASEAN member states are at different levels of development, ASEAN centrality means that within the grouping, there would be support for each other, a rising tide that lifts all boats. In this, the initiative for ASEAN integration was put in place to support equitable development and narrow the development gap. This is implemented through the IAI Work Plan 2021 to 2025. As important as it is to ensure that voices and concerns of the member states not involved in some of the regional agreements are brought to the table, I'm not sure how effective that has been. Apart from this, it is expected that ASEAN provides a platform for regional dialogue to take a collective position in the interest of regional peace and stability. Here too, I'm less convinced that ASEAN has fulfilled its proactive mandate. But ASEAN matters. The numbers speak for themselves. ASEAN is home to almost 10% of global population, of which more than 2/3 are of working age. Over the next few years, the number of middle income and affluent households are expected to grow by around 5% annually. This gives ASEAN a strong demographic advantage and a sizable market. ASEAN GDP in 2022 is valued at around US 3.6 trillion, or 3.7% of global GDP. This is expected to grow by nearly 5% each year over the next few years. ASEAN's trade is also forecast to grow at an average of 3.5 to 5% until 2031, much faster than the global average of 2.5%. ASEAN has already overtaken China in terms of market share for greenfield FDI. ASEAN is also a key player in many sectors, including consumer electronics, apparel, automotive sector. Across sectors, ASEAN has a noticeably higher share of foreign value added in gross exports compared with other economies. These developments give ASEAN an interest to keep the region free and open. But ASEAN can do more. Focus must be on community and not communities. Issues cannot be parceled off into the three components. For example, the discussion on human rights, gender equality, environment, mainly take place in the social-cultural community, that particular pillar. And we know how the conversations on global value chains and global supply chains must include equity, must include labor, must include human rights, and must include environmental concerns. Likewise, the nexus between politics, security, and trade. There has to be structural change in ASEAN, a rethink of how it is organized, how to strengthen the conversation among the three communities with the small c, so as to achieve community with a capital C. So going from the communities with a small c to community with a capital C. This will enable ASEAN to formulate a more cohesive ASEAN voice on the global stage, whether it is at the WTO, the climate talks, at APEC, or at any international organization where 1, 7, or all members are represented. Only then will ASEAN centrality matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Next, we have Professor KUNIMATSU Maki, who's Professor, Faculty of Global Management and Associate Director, International Center at Chuo University, and an expert in international trade. Okay. Over to you, KUNIMATSU-san.
Thank you very much, Shiro-san, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon. I'm Maki KUNIMATSU from Chuo University. It is great honor for me to be joining this panel. Since I have been studying international economic law, my presentation will be focusing on how rule-oriented international economic order will be maintained and recovered. If we look at the frameworks of international economic rules with ASEAN at the center, we have such a full variety. In addition, some ASEAN +1 frameworks have been made, and APEC, with its voluntary liberalization, has also played an important role historically. And furthermore, there are, of course, many regional, minilateral, and bilateral frameworks for high-level dialogue between leaders and ministers and exchanges between the business community. Experts are pointing out today that ASEAN faces a number of challenges: sustainable economic development through energy transition, the upgrading and resilience of supply chain, digitalization to address regional disparities, environment issues, the creation of industry for the purpose, and further economic integration. It is important to utilize all of the economic frameworks in a multi-layered manner, paying attention to the nature of different economic frameworks, which differ in terms of their functions and participating countries. Of these, WTO and free trade agreements, among others, are the cornerstones for maintaining the rule-oriented international economic framework and order. To keep the agreement functioning, there are necessary elements. Today, I would like to cover 4 of them here, namely rulemaking, monitoring, dispute settlement, and cooperation. With regard to the formation of new rules through negotiations, the WTO has been actually not functioning very well since the Doha development agenda ran into the deadlock. This has been made up for by FTAs. And then within the CPTPP and IPEF, new rules in new areas such as digital, environment, and labor are expected to be developed, which are essential for sustainable development and digitalization of ASEAN agenda. It is also hoped that the rule established in FTAs and other agreements will be eventually brought together and made into rules in the WTO in the future, ideally. For dispute settlement, the appellant body of WTO suspended its function since 2019. As a result, many cases have been appealed from the panel, which is the first court, but not taken up by the appellant body, which is the final court. The widespread practice of appeals into the void avoided the determination of the panel's decisions and its implementation based on it, and thus undermines the functioning of WTO dispute settlement, as well as undermining the legitimacy of rule-based economic order. In view of the situation in April 2020, some WTO members launched a multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, MPIA. This is an arbitration framework based on Article 25 of WTO Understanding on Dispute Settlement. Japan has joined the MPIA in March this year. This arbitration framework, available only after the parties have agreed to arbitrate, has begun to be utilized. In addition to the 2 cases where awards have been issued, there are cases the process of arbitration proceedings under the MPIA, many against China. Australia and Japan are the parties of some cases. Apart from MPIA, progress is also expected in the trade agreements. Under CPTPP dispute settlement, first final report was published early this month for the case between Canada and New Zealand. Managing and monitoring the application of existing rules also has implication to this panel's questions on economic coercion. Economic coercion by China has been prominent in recent years. The cases listed here are only a few examples. According to the data from Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the number has increased particularly since year 2010. Measures of economic coercion and economic security should be closely monitored in light of WTO and FTA rules. The 2010 rare earth case resulted in Japan's winning case by WTO dispute settlement. Even before reaching that stage, it is possible to check violation to the agreements. For example, Japan's recent request from consultation with China under RCEP is due to the administrative function of the agreement. And accession of FTAs is also part of management of agreements. As far as possible, it is better to follow precedents and process in a rule-oriented manner. Finally, while international cooperation has many dimensions and objectives, cooperation based on trade agreements here should be seen as strengthening the rule-based economic order. It should be upgraded through individual dialogue or to find a more inclusive and diverse form of cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kunimatsu-san. Our next speaker is Professor Wang Dong, who's Executive Director of the Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding at Peking University, and who coined the term re-globalization, I believe. So over to you, Dong.
Thank you very much, Shiro. First of all, let me also express my gratitude for RIETI and the ANU for inviting me to attend this very important gathering here. It is my privilege and honor to be here. I was told by Shiro that I only have 7 minutes. As you know, we professors usually give 3-hour lectures, so it will be a little bit difficult for me, but I will try nevertheless. In the 7 minutes I have, I would like to share some of my perspective about the role China plays in the regional economic cooperation as well as the global economic development. So my presentation will divide into 2 parts. First of all, China's role that China plays to regional and global economic growth. According to the World Bank statistics from 2013 to 2021, China's average contribution rate to global economic growth is actually close to 40%, exceeding the total contribution rate of G7 economies combined. And also between 2008 and 2021, as the world per capita GDP grew by 30% and China's by 263%, China actually accounted for more than 40% of all global growth. But if you exclude China from the data, global GDP over that period of time would have grown not by 51%, but actually only by 33%. And the per capita growth would shrink to 12% from 30%. And I also would like to quote from a recent New York Times article. The effect of China's rise is even more remarkable at the lower end of the income spectrum, where 800 million Chinese were lifted out of global poverty in recent decades. And China was actually responding for roughly 45% of the total reduction in the global measure of extreme poverty since 1981. And also based on Bloomberg statistics, China's slice of global GDP expansion is expected to represent 22.6% of total world growth through 2028. And in total, 75% of global growth is expected to be concentrated in 20 countries, and over half of that in the top 5, China, India, the United States, and Indonesia. So the BRICS countries also are expected to add almost 40% of the world growth through 2028. And growth in the Asia Pacific is forecast to accelerate to 4.6% this year. And one of the main drivers, of course, is the reopening of China since the COVID, and where the surging consumption is boosting growth across the region despite weak demand from the rest of the world. This is the report from IMF, World Economic Outlook, published in April this year. And according to Madam Chris Daniela Georgieva, the managing director of IMF, she said, I'm quote here, China this year is going to contribute about 1/3 of global growth, which will provide more opportunities to other countries. We calculated that 1% more growth in China translate into 0.3% more growth for the economies that are connected to China. And also, the IMF projected that Chinese economy will grow quite strongly by 5.2% this year. Now I'll move very quickly to second part. China's economic interactions or closely connected with the Asian economy. Of course, as we all know, the Asian economy now accounts for 1/3 of the world economy, and it remains the most dynamic region in the world. So in October 2013, China proposed to establish AIIB, which now has the membership of 106, and also making the second largest development bank next to the World Bank. And Rebecca mentions ASEP, and we also had a little bit of discussion about that last night during dinner. The ASEP now, it accounts about 47.4% of world population, over 32% of global GDP, and about 30% of global trade volume. So making it the largest trade bloc ever we have in history. So in a time of great uncertainty, ASEP provides an opportunity to elevate the economic welfare of all member countries. And Shiro mentioned that. And in the past few years, one of the major works I've been working on is globalization. And we all know that in recent years, a lot of pessimistic talk about where globalization will be heading. People talk about great power rivalry, strategic competition, and regional military conflict, etc. And there's some people believe the globalization is dead, or we are now entering into a so-called deglobalization period. But I make the argument that globalization is not dead. Instead, it enters into a new phase, which I label it, I call it reglobalization. And as the world's second largest economy, the largest trading country, the largest contributor to global economic growth, China has increasingly become a leader in the reglobalization process, and which is most symbolic when Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote speech at Davos in January 2017, where he firmly defended economic globalization. Please allow me also to do a little bit of self-promotion here. I published actually one of the first systemic book-length studies on reglobalization as early as back in 2018. And I defined reglobalization as a process of upgrading and restructuring globalization in which different actors are working to rebuild the dynamics of globalization. It is, can be viewed as an upgrading and expansion of the old operation system, just like the computer. And I've got endorsement from some leading academics around the world. Professor Amitav Achaya, president of the International Study Association, former, he said this is a timely and important work, providing an authoritative Chinese perspective on the profound changes occurring to the globalization process. And another Professor Kishu Mahbubani from Singapore, and he said this is an indispensable guide and absolutely must read for who want to understand our new world order. Anyway, so if you're interested in it, you're more than welcome to read it, and of course, welcome all critics. And I'm very delighted to see actually the director of the WTO, Madam Okino Awila. She published an essay in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago. She said within WTO, they start also talking about reglobalization now. So I'm very happy that this concept now has attracted more attention especially from the policy community. So now I'll move very quickly. So I'm coming to conclude, Shiro, so no hurry. Innovation. China has also, over the years, developed into one of the most innovative economies in the world. So the Global Innovation Index ranks economies according to their innovation capabilities. And as you can see from this data charts and the table, it shows that relative GDP, China's performance is above expectation. It's quite good, actually, for its level of economic development. So now, let me conclude by quoting from President Xi during one of his remarks at the recent BRICS summit in South Africa. This is what he says, and I quote here. A Chinese adage reads, victory is ensured when people pool their strengths. Success is secured when people put their heads together. Let us stay committed and united to build a community of shared development and make sure that in the process of global modernization, no country is left behind. I will conclude here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Duong. Next speaker is Nguyen An Duong, who's Director of Department for General Economic Issues and Integration Studies at CIEM in Vietnam, and is the Vietnam's rep on the Economic Committee at APEC. Over to you, Duong.
Good afternoon, honorable professors, distinguished speakers, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm thankful to RIETI and ANU for the opportunity to speak here today. And I tried to be very brief, talking about the two substance of my topic within the 7 minutes. The first one is about my perspectives about the ASEAN centrality in the new context. And the next one would be some brief points regarding the adaptive approach to de-risking and anti-coercion in the new context as well. So about the ASEAN centrality, it's hard to talk after Dr. Rebecca's important message already, but I think I tried, but there is something we should additionally note from the ongoing process. The first thing is ASEAN is living under a mixture of the opportunities and challenges, and even today. The thing we know is that we are still uncertain about to what extent the opportunities and the challenges are, and we are facing the investment shift in the context of the U.S.-China decoupling. Some economies are benefiting from it. Some are trying to compete for this one, and there is also a growing role of ASEAN recognized by the international community after the successful hosting of the major events in 2022, 2023. Last year we have the successful ASEAN in Cambodia, the APEC in Thailand, and G20 in Indonesia. This year, the conclusion of the ASEAN summit in Indonesia was also remarkable as well. And we also see that there is the RCEP coming into force, but but it's not the end of the regional integration process yet. After the RCEP, we start to see the negotiation for upgradation of some ASEAN +1 FTAs, including ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, Korea, and the ongoing ASEAN-China FTA. And the key important thing I noted when talking to different stakeholders is that it's true that we are unsatisfied with the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, with the RCEP and the IPEF conference, to the extent that they are lacking substance. So, but they do share a common characteristic, that they offer the chance for everyone to sit together after a tough time, a time of uncertainty, a time of disbelief. So being able to sit together is the first step, and whatever they achieve is very important for us to come closer to the next step. So in that context, we need to promote the ASEAN centrality, and there's different dimensions we can take. The first important thing is that we need to make the ASEAN integration process more relevant and more meaningful. And in this process, I want to emphasize that it is the ASEAN integration, not just the ASEAN economic integration. And to do that, after the points we heard from Dr. Rebecca, which I fully agree, I think that's also a need to restructure the ASEAN Secretariat, and we need a better capacitated ASEAN Secretariat. I also work at APEC, and I'm always impressed by the ASEAN, by the APEC Secretariat and the staff there, and the members there are very responsive, sharp-minded, and outcome-oriented. And if we can have the same improvement capacity for the ASEAN Secretariat, we can do a lot better. And of course, we also recognize that a lot of the gap in capacity is being filled by the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, or ERIA, at this stage. But we need some in-house capacity and the personal capacity of ASEAN Secretariat as well. And in order to have that, I think the sense of the leaders, ASEAN leaders, in terms of promoting the sense of community, the sense of working together, going through the tough time together, and achieving joy, prosperity together is also important. And to have that, we need to come through concrete steps. And one of the key concrete steps is that the collaboration. We need a collaboration in attracting foreign investment. Our idea of ASEAN Economic Community is a single production base, not a fragmented production base. And that's why we need the ASEAN collaboration in attracting foreign investment. It's true that some members are having more investment, some are having less, but the idea is that these investments must be interconnected and fit in with the view of the regional production network. And the next one is that we also need to foster an ASEAN perspective in the various arrangements. Some ASEAN members are being part of the CPTPP. We are all part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but some members are now part of the IPEF negotiations. And some are part of the APEC with the future for the FTAP. So we have membership and participation in various processes yet. And so that is our position. But our mindset has to be aligned with the ASEAN view as well. And with that, I think ASEAN needs to provide the platform for dialogues and work with superpowers, either directly and jointly, on concrete initiatives beyond the economic issues. And in that, we have, I think, Shiro and other experts have a very important book on the economic security nexus, and we can learn a lot from it. But my view is that gradualism still have a role there. I think we don't need to. It's not a one step ahead. So what? Incremental steps also important, but the key thing is we need to ensure that those steps are not path dependent. And the second thing is we need an iterative process. We need to work harder over time, so we can achieve the outcome. And on that basis, I think we can have an adaptive approach to de-risking. The first substance is that we need to ensure the core economic benefits for all parties. Notwithstanding the politicizations, the geopolitical tension in this stage, the values, the profit of the investors are still very important. And they talk about resilience, but at the end of the day, the profits, the productivity, and it's also important for them. And that's why I think we should learn from the past experience with the regional FTA. For example, with the RCEP, Australia and China managed to be part of the RCEP at the end of the day. So it's very, very important for all members. And the other thing is that we also need to engage with the foreign investors, and I think we had a very good experience from Vietnam working with the investor during the COVID time, because at that time the investor were part of the economy of Vietnam. They worked with their government to call for support in terms of vaccines for Vietnam. And on that basis, we can work together to incubate new ideas for collaboration. This is the way the APEC has been doing extremely well, even in this context. But we can think of structural reform as an important areas for collaboration, because structural reform, it matters for all the economies, matter everywhere, and all the stakeholders. There is no limit for it. There is no border for the structural reform as well. And so we can also start on concrete initiatives in relative new areas, and ASEAN has worked on that, such as the framework on circular economy, the blue economy framework. And finally, the new role for think tanks, which is very important to foster the dialogue, but more fundamentally, the people-to-people connectivity, which has been agreed under the ASEAN framework and APEC framework. And so, in common, de-risking anti-coercion, we need to be part of the multilateral trading systems. In doing so, we need to first respect the rules. And second, we need to contribute to writing rules. We are not free rider in the process. We have to be a responsible part of the process, and we need to contribute to writing the rules as the rule evolve. And finally, we still need to keep the mindset of multilateralism. And people talk about TPP or CPTPP in Vietnam, RCEP and EVFTA, but people usually don't recognize that Vietnam had the negotiation of all these things at the same time. And that is one of the strategy to harmonize the interactions with different partners, but also in a consistent way with the multilateral trading system. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Duong. And last but not least, we have Lili Yan Ing, who's lead advisor at ERIA in Jakarta, but also Secretary General of the International Economic Association, and has spent time in the Trade Minister and President's offices in Indonesia. Over to you, Lili.
Thank you, Shiro. Professor Urata, Professor Drysdale, Kobayashi-sans, Yoshida-sans, respected speakers, chair. It's really such a great pleasure to meet old friends and meeting new friends. And I really appreciate the ANU and RIETI brought up these very important issues on how to strengthen multilateral trading systems and what are the role of Asia. Before I start, let me share with you two observations. First, I don't pretend to know the US economy because I don't know. But regardless Democrats or Republicans will be in the White House next term, the US foreign policies towards China will remain the same. Likewise, China foreign trade policies towards the US. So we should be prepared of the escalating US-China trade, technology, and security tensions. The second observation is that it took 75 years for telephones to get 100 million users, but it took only 2 months for ChatGPT to get the same milestone. Now ChatGPT has 1.8 billion users worldwide every month. So that's how fast and how massive developments of digital transformations. Those two observations will gonna affect global trade, at least in the coming 2 decades. Now let's discuss ASEAN in global trade. As we can see here, the last 5 years we have been experiencing the highest pressures in supply chains, if it in the modern trade era, if it is not in the histories. The combinations between the US-China trade tensions, COVID-19, and lately the war in Russia put a lot of pressures on the global supply chains. And that's affecting global trade worldwide, including in East Asia. But apparently, ASEAN countries, they did relatively well. The ASEAN's economy last year recorded an economic growth of 5.6%. It's estimated to grow 4.6% this year and will be growing at 4.7% next year. The impressive economic growth of ASEAN is a combination of good policy and good luck. The good policy part is that if we see over the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2022, ASEAN's economy has been able to manage relatively reasonable ratio of debt to GDP and relatively low fiscal deficits to GDP, which were recorded at 60% and 1.9% respectively over those 2 decades. That makes ASEAN's economy, macroeconomic, relatively sounding compared to other regions. That's the good policy part. The good luck part, we can see here the left-hand side is trade of ASEAN's countries. The right-hand side is ASEAN's trade shares to the world. ASEAN's, in the last 3 years, recorded trade surplus, and we can see a massive increase in its exports. Those mainly driven by increase in commodity prices of coal and palm oil. So not necessarily value added in ASEAN's exports. And we can see over the last 2 decades, the increase in the share of ASEAN's trade to the world is relatively very low, from 7% to 8.4%. ASEAN, like is any other countries in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, and any other countries in the world, we are benefiting from globalizations. And that's why it's very important for ASEAN and other ASEAN countries, as well as other countries in the world, to strengthen the multilateral trading systems. And how can we do it? What we propose is that first, we need to ensure the multilateral trading systems well functioning. And we need to increase and strengthen the multilateral trading systems to also include the issues on climate change and digitalizations, including robots and AI. Keep trade and investments policies open and fair, no punitive unilateral actions allowed, as well as improve intra-East Asia trade and investments. Second, invest in logistic and maritime infrastructure. As of today, 90% of trade at the global level are transmitted in the oceans. So it's very important for us to modernize logistic systems via the maritime infrastructure. Last is invest in digital transformations. As I mentioned in the beginning, whether we like it or not, it's not a choice, it's whether we want to embrace digital transformations or not. We don't have any privilege whether we want to take it or not. We are already in, and we will be in the digital transformations era. So it's very important for us to optimize the use of digital technology in supply chains and facilitate firms to be able to participate in digitalized supply chains. It is also very important for us to improve in physical and digital infrastructures. With this, I would like to end the discussions. We welcome very much your questions. You can give difficult questions to Dr. Rebecca and just give me the easy ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lili. And those presentations really open up a huge set of issues, and questions are coming in already, and thank you very much for that. We're going to dive straight into it with what is, I want to get to a question on industrial policy that's on here in a second, but I think we'll go straight to a very difficult and important issue on economic coercion. So this was raised especially in KUNIMATSU-san's presentation, but others as well. The question that's come in is, how can economic coercion be countered and limits put on the use of economic weaponry? How can strategic competition between China and the United States avoid damaging the region's interests? Now, this is in the context, I think, of discussion still of an anti-coercion instrument by some countries. I think Kunimatsu-san made the point quite clearly that what we have to do in response has to be WTO consistent, that is, consistent with the established rules. But countries are raising this issue because they want a deterrent. You know, the WTO and the established rules do take time to take effect. Now, legal systems take time. You have to have due process, of course, allow for out-of-court settlements, as we see in the WTO, similar to domestic cases. You know, domestic law. Why is international trade different, I suppose, is a question. But I think Kunimatsu-san listed a number of episodes of economic coercion, and they all seem to involve China, of course. Now, I think we've had some experience with economic coercion from the United States as well, under Trump. We might see that under a second Trump administration or even any other president. But of course, no country is really innocent in this, and I think Japan deployed some measures against South Korea that South Korea would probably like to have an anti-coercion instrument for. So I guess a question, an issue that I want to lay out there following on this question is, you know, would an anti-coercion instrument weaken the WTO and the existing system, or act as a deterrent and consistent with the system? And also, would this sort of instrument be able to be deployed against Japan, the United States, Australia, and other countries? So who'd like to take that relatively easy question? Rebecca, you want to jump in?
It's unfair, but yeah. No, but I really think that economic coercion, you know, if you want to have anti-coercion measures, you got to first define what is economic coercion, and a broad brush definition or very specific. Is it sector specific? So I mean, whatever action you take can come back to haunt you or to bite you. So defining those areas in lieu of the fact that you don't have WTO reform. My first course of action will always be the WTO, right? And then really defining what it is that you're looking at. What is it you want to do? Taking politics out of the equation is very important, I think. Looking at the economics of it and the impact of that on trade and investment, especially for the smaller economies going forward. I think that's, I mean, this is all still pretty much new to me. You know, I'm not, as I said, I'm not a researcher. I'm just a policymaker looking at things from the outside, looking in and seeing how things are developing. Really, at the end of the day, it's going back to data, going back to strengthening WTO reform and WTO rules. If we're looking at the middle economies, so ASEAN clearly has a role here. I'm not sure how much of this discussion is taking place within ASEAN. So because we, at the end of the day, you know, things, what goes around comes around, as they say. So I would be very careful how I would approach this.
Anyone else want to jump in? Lili? Oh, Duong first?
Oh, you want Lili?
Oh, there you go.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. I think like decoupling, de-risking, friendshoring, any kind of terms that you name it, we're gonna increase inefficiency, which will lead to increase in prices. And at the end of the day, it's us, consumers, worldwide, we're gonna pay the higher prices of this increase in efficiency. The second point is that on the anti-coercion coalitions, there are two things. One is that I just want to highlight what Dr. Rebecca mentions. Two things. One is the meaning of anti-coercion itself and the common concerns. Because, for example, this is raised by G7 countries, right? Who is the common concerns? Because for Japan, probably South Korea automobile is common concerns. For Australia and New Zealand's exporting beef, dairy products, Japan is a common concerns. For Indonesia, Malaysia, Europe is common concern when it comes to exporting palm oil. So when G7 raised this idea of anti-coercion coalitions and have a certain mind of common concern as a country, let's take a minute, put ourselves in the shoes of the rest of the world. Probably the rest of the world may see G7 countries as a common concern for the rest of the world. So this kind of definitions of the anti-coercions and definitions of common concerns might be backfires to our own countries. So I think instead of implement this kind of anti-coercion coalitions, I would suggest we as middle power countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, ASEAN countries, we should sit together to ensure that there are no more punitive unilateral actions. Even without that coalitions, in 2022, there were 2,600 protectionist measures introduced across investments, goods, and services. So I think we should group together to against any punitive unilateral actions, and then we should put a lot of efforts to strengthening open and fair multilateral trading systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Lili. Duong?
Okay. Maki-san, you did a very detailed list of the many cases. I was wondering when you were listening to your presentation, when I next do a case study about the economic coercion by the United States, I probably should turn you for help. There are two things as a social scientist, as a colleague in social science, I would like to mention. One, I echo Rebecca's mentioning of the definition. I think to make this concept a scientific concept, it is very important to define it in a very clear scientific way. If you make it too broad, for instance, everything China does is called economic coercion. Everything the United States and its allies do is called defending their national interest. This is bad social science, and it could lead to hypocrisy in policy terms. So I think this is something first caveat, I think I believe we should bear in mind. Secondly, I think this is also a, sorry to say that, this is what we academics do, right, in conferences, but I think this is also a problem in case selection bias. In other words, in terms of the data, you pick and choose everything China does, but this is not a complete data set, because there's a huge missing part, right? Because United States, actually, we all know, the US academics and policy communities, they coined this term. They developed this concept of economic coercion, and they use that in military terms as well. And so there are so many, United States being the hegemonic power, there are hundreds of thousands of cases where United States practice economic coercion, and China remains one of the biggest victims of the practice of the American economic coercion. So when we talk about that, I think this is also my strong sense when I'm listening to the remarks from academic colleagues and our hosts to make this productive discussion. It's very important that we should not politicize this concept and using it as a sort of political rhetoric to single out certain country, like in this case, China, and criticize certain policies. Of course, I think, in a globalized world, we interact so intimately on daily basis. No wonder there will be disputes, disagreement, just like in everyday life. That's why we have the WTO. We have this, disputes resolution system, but thanks to the United States, now it's in parallels. I think the last thing we should do is to politicize this concept and then use it as a rhetoric to target certain countries. I think this is really against
the spirit of cooperation and mutual understanding. And I suspect, forgive me to say this, I suspect it will be counterproductive to the end. Maybe politically it's useful to gain some political points, but at the end of the day, what's the benefits of if we are really looking to the common goods, together, working together to dealing with the challenges facing the region and the world economy together. I think we really should be going beyond this parochial sort of perspective or definition or conceptualization of economic coalition. I think that way, we can make this conversation really helpful and really productive and helping the common goods we're aiming at. Sorry for being very frank.
That's okay. Point taken.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into a back and forth on this, but Kunimatsu-san, just Japan signed up to MPIA. I think that's a real positive for the global system and enforcing trade rules. I guess a question about this is, what should countries do when they're hit by unilateral sanctions or just protectionist measures, really? It's sort of in the interpretation as well. Some of these do look like unilateral sanctions for politically motivated sanctions. Because usually these measures backfire on the countries anyway. Don't they? Economically, politically, protectionism usually hurts yourself. Now, retaliating, of course, doubles down on that damage, but policymakers are under a lot of pressure to retaliate or to do something. If you just sit there and try to convince your community or your public that this is the least damaging thing to do, not to retaliate, that's hard to swallow. But in Australia's case, hit by sanctions, trade blockages, Australian exporters were able to find other markets precisely because of the open multilateral trading system. So this is a protection against shocks, all kinds of shocks, natural disasters, politically motivated shocks, protectionism. So I think, you raised the issue, and it's an important issue, but what should countries do in response to these sorts of shocks or these measures, whether they're politically motivated or not?
Thank you very much for giving me the difficult question. Unilateralism sounds like before WTO world, but still we have WTO agreements now. So I always come back that our basis is how we interpret the WTO. Everything which is relating to the articles should be dealt with the WTO and FTA rules. So the one thing is that we developed a rule with the exact definition, like Rebecca mentioned. And just briefly, thank you, Duong. I'm looking forward to working with you to develop my list. And then also, sorry, Shiro, but I would like to mention one thing about the economic coercion. In addition to the academic side, data and analysis, and the political side, I think we need to still have the viewpoint from business, because they have got the most impact in the front of the business. So I believe that already sort of alliance or the measures among the business field will be under development to tackle with these sort of unilateral actions. So they are trying to seek the sort of alternative route for procurement, for example. So I really would like to look forward to that development. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunimatsu-san.
Just
Very quickly.
Very quickly, 2 seconds. I respond to your questions, and I think what we need to do is to really abide by the rules of the multilateral trading system. First of all, on top priority, we need to restore the trade disputing system at the WTO, and just to make the WTO really vibrant and dynamic. This is, I think, it's very urgent. It's on the top priority. Should be on the top priority of our policymakers in all countries. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Now, there are a few questions here on the losers from globalization and what to do. And I think it's worth just touching on this and having a couple of responses, because it is at the heart of a lot of say, what's happening in the United States, a retreat from openness and a rise in protectionism. Really, the lack of compensation of the losers from trade and globalization and technological change. But what does this look like in Vietnam, Duong? A rapidly growing Vietnam that's integrating very quickly into the global economy. Surely there are a lot of people losing jobs. Do they move to new sectors? Do you have permanently unemployed? How do you look at compensating the losers, if at all?
Thank you. I think about the loser economic integration. This is part of our when we develop the strategy for economic integration, we have a substance part of managing the domestic consensus in this process. So the domestic consensus involves the information about the process, about the opportunities, challenges, but the more substance part of it is the capacity building. And I think with Vietnam and ASEAN partner already work under various FTAs, and the key characteristic of ASEAN FTAs is the development cooperation. And I think that is also part of the provision where the more advanced partner can provide the support and technical assistance to developing countries like Vietnam to upgrade. And so in that process, the FTA is not just like a competition. It's also about growing together, having a win-win relationship, and over time we start to grow together for shared prosperity. And I think that is we also replicated the same approach when having the different FTAs, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the TPP, and the EU-Vietnam FTA. But unfortunately, at this stage, it's a bit pity to see that the majority of people in Vietnam, when they talk about TPP or CPTPP, about EVFTA, the first thing they see is what Vietnam is committed to do. How is the business affected? But the 3-page chapter related to cooperation and capacity building is never read, and that is also part of the process we are working on at this stage. But I think, I think that's one thing, and the other part is that the capacity building is also, we also emphasize that, because even the delivery of the capacity building, I mean, whether it's on the traditional issues or the new issues, which is very important, but how to ensure the inclusion of stakeholders in the process is also part of the strategy that we pay attention to.
Thanks.
Just
Rebecca,
to chip in, I think there are a couple of things. You have the FTAs, as has been pointed out, but we have to be very conscious of what we're doing in this process. When you talk of losers, I don't know whether you want to use the word losers, but important here is engaging. Folks tend to think that what we do in APEC, what we do in ASEAN is really for the big businesses. But I think there's a strong element in all the FTAs on SMEs, SME development. It's also important, FTAs and all these international agreements are not panaceas. I mean, we have to accept that they're not panaceas, and there has to be a lot of domestic work in this context. So for example, for the SMEs, we've got to make sure that they benefit through integrating into supply chain. So how do you do this? You ensure, and for example, take the example of Malaysia, we make sure that there are clinics to bring together the big MNCs together with the SMEs to see how we can match them, right? That's one. 2, educating the SMEs so that they understand the technicalities around the FTAs. Business facilitation is key. FTAs are good, but business facilitation, structural reform, equally important. Then when you talk of ensuring that there are no losers from economic integration, one of the key things that we talk about is making sure we get FDI. Yes, FDI good, but FDI not at all costs, right? We have to also, as policymakers, think about that and ensure that with the FDI, you have to do 2 things in my book. One is environmental impact assessments, very important, but the other and more important is the social impact assessment. Some of these investments, yes, the numbers are good. We're going to create X number of jobs, but how many folks are going to be displaced? So that's the other thing, that we need to have that balance, and we have to insist on social impact assessments. Those things are more difficult to measure, but extremely, extremely important if you want to make sure that, as this question says, there are no losers. So those things I think are important. I think going forward, as Peru takes over at APEC next year, one of the things they've put on the table is how do we engage the domestic constituents to see how we can move folks in the informal sector to the formal sector, because there's that benefit that comes with it, and the messaging, the engagement with civil society, with indigenous groups. I think these are important, and these are things that we spend a lot of time in APEC on, yeah? And I think this would then help to bring the temperature down a bit and help folks understand the importance of globalization, importance of trade and investment. Thank you.
Yeah, and judging by the questions, it's a very educated audience, but FDI is, of course, foreign direct investment. And we're talking about compensating losers. There will be losers from globalization and economic integration. And I think all the things you said are right, but to go with that, obviously, being able to identify the losers means you're better able to compensate them. But it's, I think, incumbent on all of our economies to keep an eye on the social safety net and the strength of that social safety net, and the disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged within our communities, to maintain that openness, to be able to, keep an open economy, to give the politicians that the ability to do so. So, unless there's anyone else on that issue, I think we might move to industrial policy. There's a great question here that keeps shifting around. And the question is, I'd like to ask about how Japan can balance economic security with a free trade order. And the context is really in the situation where the United States and Europe implement industrial policies, they give priority to their own. So, of course, this is in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and huge subsidies now there for energy transition in the United States, of course, and justifiable in from a domestic perspective in a second best world to an extent, but this is in breach of international trade rules and what the United States has been accusing China of doing for a long time, these industrial subsidies. Now, many countries are busy trying to get some of these subsidies or not being cut out of US markets. But of course, as the question mentions, Europe has responded with its own industrial subsidies and industrial policy. Indonesia, of course, has a whole downstreaming plan with restricting export of nickel, for example. Are we not headed for a race to the bottom on this? And a race to the bottom where we're all worse off? And I guess the question is, how should we respond? So it's a pretty big question, but it's a big issue that I think we're all thinking about. Who'd like to go first? Maybe I'll volunteer someone. Kunimatsu-san, maybe, because the question did start with how does Japan balance its economic security interests with a free trade order?
Yeah. The meaning of balance is very difficult. That's balance of economic context or political or even, even philosophical balance. I'm not sure. But in fact, the Japanese Economic Security Promotion Act, that's very consistent to WTO as long as we see it now. So that's again the cornerstone that we as long as the written law and regulations here is consistent, and then that's again the cornerstone. And regarding the subsidies, we have another agreement, SCM. So subsidy and countervailing measures agreement within the WTO agreements. So that we still keep on that. And then, but still there's some lack of interpretation in the agreement. So to fill that lack of interpretation of multilateral rule, what we have, we can or we should discuss and try to elaborate the understanding of the ruling. For example, like minor country can do, or advanced FTA might try to, make a little bit more detailed agreement on that.
Thank you. Duong?
Okay, I just want to brief about the past examples of Japan and Vietnam working together on something called the Joint Industrialization Strategy. And at that time, after 2011, you're probably aware that after the Fukushima incidents and also the flood in Thailand, Japan decided to work together with Vietnam to develop the Joint Industrialization Strategy. There was nothing part of Japan in terms of the content, but the idea at that time was that Japan support Vietnam in developing an industrialization strategy for Vietnam, but based on the practical needs of Vietnam and the interest of foreign investors. It was the first time we had the Japanese embassy, Japanese investors sitting together with Vietnamese stakeholders and policymakers in the same room, same time, and talking about different sectors, what are the priorities, what are the actions needed, and over time, and we conclude with a strategy for that and 6 action plan for 6 sectors, including automotive, electronics, food processing, shipbuilding, energy saving, and environmental and energy savings. So the key essence about the process is not just about the output, the decision by the Prime Minister or the action plan, but it's more about the outcome oriented. And I think along the process, we also had the first important thing was the capacity building in industrial policy making. So our stakeholders learn about the practice of the partners, noting the ongoing process in terms of the region. That's one thing. But at that time, the context was only until 2015. But the second thing, which is more important, which is to foster the trust of countries in the region, both government to government and investor to investor and government to investor, because this is very important to convey the same message that we are working together for the benefits of the investor, of the hosting country, and also for the resilience of the supply chain.
Thanks, Duong. Dong?
Very quickly, this is a great question. I also agree it's a very difficult question. I think 2 broad points I want to make. First of all, I agree there is a very difficult relationship, I think, for all policymakers in all countries will have to balance, which is the security consideration and the need for free trade. And this is also a question I've been thinking about in the past few years, which is a concept in international relations. It's called a securitization. But there's it's very easily for policymakers to overstep the bounds, the limits, and become over-securitization. And then it's sort of pursuing more security than you need, and therefore it harming the economic benefits. That's, I think, the recent trend we see in globalization. A lot of countries, many countries, they put more and more emphasis on economic security. But how to balance that, I think it backs more, I think, theoretical studies. It's at least, I think, a job, calling for academics to do more research. Number one. Number two, I think industrial policy, it's nothing new. We have Yoshida-san here representing METI, and METI is known, right, for helping producing the Japanese economic miracle, and where industrial policy play a very important role. So when I was sort of trying to figure out when industrial policy all of a sudden became a bad word. I think perhaps in recent years, when the United States become increasingly unhappy with China because of the economic sort of, growth, and there's disputes between China and the United States, and the United States began sort of pointing finger at China, and then the term in the political rhetoric in the narrative in the United States, it became a bad term, and oftentimes used to target China. So I think the question is that the WTO actually is insufficient. Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong. Insufficient in designing mechanism and rules in regulating states, countries, their policy behavior in terms of industrial policy. So maybe one thing we can do is to to really improve or better sort of negotiate better rules and mechanisms under WTO, and by distinguishing between legitimate industrial policies and illegitimate industry policy. So where are the boundaries, right? And whenever disputes arise, and what is the mechanism that with which WTO could rule on? And again, goes back to the needs I just mentioned, that for restoring the disputes resolution mechanism under WTO, etc. So I think we need to do a lot of work. I think all stakeholders, all countries, if we really want to defend the multilateral trading system, we have to work very hard. This is something apparently is missing. That's why there is concern. I think, Shiro, you are absolutely right. There is a danger of all countries racing to the bottom because there's no WTO, rules regulating that. It's absent. So that's again also a cause for the need that we work hard, sort of. To make this up. I understand it's not easy, especially when politics comes in, but at least I think from a scholarly point of view, we can start thinking in theoretical terms, and then we see how we can move gradually to policies.
Can I just make a point here? The WTO is not this amorphous being, it's us. We are the WTO. I mean, if we are not in the room helping to, make the rules and correct the rules and ensuring reform, don't blame it on this organization. Blame it on us. So I think that's where there is a place for organizations to input in. Yes, it's this huge thing, 164 members, but there is this place, for us to input into that process, whether it is in having those conversations in APEC or having those conversations in ASEAN. And as I said, unfortunately in ASEAN, conversations are limited to those pillars. So when you're talking about economic security, the one group that's missing is the political security pillar folks are not in the room when the economic officials are talking about trade liberalization and globalization. Likewise, there was a question that talked about losers. That has to do with inclusiveness. And when the inclusive portion of the work we're doing in ASEAN is relegated to another pillar, the social cultural pillar, so gender issues, youth, climate, and all the others are happening in that sphere, and there's no cross-forum conversations, cross-community conversations. This is what happens. Then you get the impression that WTO is not working, ASEAN is not working, APEC is not working. But we are the ones. We are WTO. We are ASEAN. We are APEC. So really, thinking about it differently and the role that each of us has, and maybe some structures within us, within our own organizations that need to change.
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, we might move on to a different topic now, a big one, given the time. And I think it follows on nicely from what Duong said about the securitization of trade. Security and trade, getting that balance right, and this has been hinted at a few times. This security imperative has led to technology decoupling between China and the United States, and other countries willingly or being pressured to join this endeavour. But I think it's worth asking at what cost, because of course, de-risking or technology decoupling for security reasons really does raise the cost of the green technologies we need and the energy transition, right? And surely avoiding catastrophic climate change is a first-order security issue, a national security issue for all of us. So a question on that to anyone who wants to answer, but also related to that issue, is cooperation on climate change an area where interests align strongly enough between the United States and China, doing something about climate change, and is that a potential issue that we can work regionally and globally together to find a framework for the United States and China to actually cooperate What do you reckon, Lili? You didn't have a go at the last set of questions, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think like it's very important for the US and China to sit together to at least on those two topics. One is climate change, the second one is on digital transformations. Those kind of two issues will gonna affect in every corner of our life. And it requires global efforts, right? It requires those two superpower countries to sit together. On the other hand, I think the role of middle power countries are also very important these days because now we are living in a multipolar world. So let's not get dragged down. I'm not saying that China is an innocent victim, right? China has its own agenda. China has its own records of mistakes. So as a middle power countries, let's not us get dragged down with the US-China decoupling strategies, like each of superpower countries have their own interests, have their own agenda. We as middle power countries, I think it's very important for us to sit together and not to take side on any other countries. And we need to mobilize power to ensure that we are all working on the right pace, allocate enough resources to tackle at least on those two issues, as well as we are working to strengthen multilateral trading systems. Thank you.
Anyone else on the climate change issue? Maybe Duong on, technology decoupling between China and the United States. I mean, even with we talked about retaliating before and economic coercion. I mean, the trade war, of course,
right.
China did retaliate against the United States.
I think the question, responding to your question, I think it's going to add huge cost. I remember, I think the day before yesterday when I was flying here from Beijing, heading to Tokyo on the airplane, I was reading an article just published in Foreign Policy, co-authored by, I think, two economists and also Kishu Mahbubani, the founding dean of the Guangyao School of Public Policy in Singapore. They are actually arguing against, criticizing the United States policy of trying to contain China in terms of, development of chips technology. It's not working. It's working against the interest of most of the chip producers in the United States because where is the biggest market? It's in China. So if you and I think the Biden, of course, to give credit to the Biden administration, they are trying to strike a balance in terms of preventing China acquiring the most advanced chip technology vis-a-vis the economic interests of the business community of the United States. But it's become increasingly unsustainable. I think this is my impression of reading this foreign policy piece. So I agree. So one thing now the Biden administration, the Europeans they stopped using decoupling. They're now using the term de-risking. So we were discussing this, right, last night during dinner. I was wondering, to what extent de-risking is really decoupling in disguise? If de-risking is just decoupling in disguise, then we're in the same old game. And there's still the danger of that the global, trading system is gonna be more fragmented, and everyone will be worse off. So, and I also very much, echo Lili when you say the ASEAN's middle power countries and everything. You actually hate to choose, not just do not like, hate to choose sides between great powers, between China and the United States. The very last thing we should do is to force the international community to do that. So again, it gets to the question, sorry, Shiro, I sort of have no answer, because in theory, we sort of, ideally there is a sort of, right, a balance, a limits to how much technology you can cooperate, you can share with another country. In that effort, you can achieve common economic benefits. And then there is more sensitive technology, like what the Biden administration trying to do. They're trying to draw a line, right? There's a more sensitive technology, and they want to set a limit on that, preventing China from acquiring that. So the article also by Kisu and his colleagues really asking the question, do you really believe that at the end of the day, you will succeed in containing China in pursuing its technological development? Yes or no? No one knows. But just look at history. The United States tried to, contain a lot of, right, missile, nuclear, space, all those technology. Of course, it's a different context, historical context, the Cold War, the old Cold War. The United States tried to do all those and failed. And how we are sure the United States will do this and it will succeed? Because China is already, it's a different country, right? It's more closely integrated with the global economies, and technology-wise, it's more advanced, etc. And how are you sure? No one's sure. And there are increasing voices now, I think, in the policy community in the United States, elsewhere. People start questioning the wisdom of that policy. So sorry, long answer short, I have no clear answer to your question. But in theory, if we can strike a balance, it will be the most ideal. But there is, in real policy terms, there are a lot of dangers that we could easily overstep and become, counterproductive.
Yep. Now we're rapidly running out of time, so a minute each perhaps. Duong and Rebecca, if you want to jump in. No? Okay. Duong.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think first, the smaller economies are concerned about we all agree to the need for digital transformation and green transition. But our concern is which are the standards and for this process, because underlying each standard can imply the choosing a side, things like that. So that is one thing. But the second thing is that we need to keep the mindset favorable for international collaboration. And because the thing is, the context may change and people may change. For example, for TPP, it was originally thought that it was the instrument to counter China. But over time, the US left it and China started applying for it. So we start to see some sort of reverse situation. And the other thing is, before the COVID-19, we were also concerned about choosing the 5G technology, whether it's US-led or China-led. And then, but after COVID, everyone thought that 5G is inevitable. So no talk about it. So, but the third one is that there is a growing role for the middle economies, for example, ASEAN and other partners. And the thing is, we can start off with some soft instrument, for example. And I think I really like the idea of DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Economic Agreement, because people complain that it's very loose. But I think it's starting off with something loose. You engage external partner, maybe the bigger ones, and then you start off with the standards, and that is an inclusive process.
Thanks, Duong. That's a great place to end it. Really, the WTO was emphasized a lot, and I want to come back to that. But importantly, it was in Japan's leader's statement for the G7 in Hiroshima. Prominently, the multilateral system and the WTO at the center of economic resilience and economic security. That was an important statement, I think. And we heard from Yoshida-san about like-minded countries in the global south earlier on. We didn't talk about that and how that sits alongside ASEAN centrality. If we think about it in those terms, seems like we're moving into a world of clubs. But of course, ASEAN is an open club, and we have to ensure these other clubs are going to be open and contribute to the multilateral system instead of dividing. I think we heard a lot about ASEAN speaking with one voice. I think it's important because what ASEAN projects, not just being an open club, but projects multilateral principles and really is a model for multipolarity of sharing of power and relating to other states. So those interests are really important. And I think, there's always a lot of criticism about ASEAN. It's not coherent enough, not working quickly enough. But I'm a glass half full, an optimist on RCEP. To be able to conclude, on ASEAN, being able to conclude RCEP at such a difficult time when there are bilateral tensions, quite significant bilateral tensions within RCEP, Australia and China, Japan and South Korea, for example. And I think this is where one question from Slido, an audience question on how can smaller countries compete and survive. I think I come back to, of course, we need a multilateral rules-based order. We need the rules, and we need, importantly, to protect that multilateral system that's built on equal treatment, on most favoured nation status and principle. So we talk about the WTO, and Rebecca's right. It's not just something out there. It's as you said, we are the WTO. I think this is where Japan putting its hand up, a bit late, but better late than never, for MPIA was really important. Only Singapore is an MPIA member within ASEAN. And this is where, as Duong said, ASEAN needs to stop free riding. Indonesia, Vietnam, others do need to join. Malaysia do need to stand up for the rules and make the rules enforceable. So I think, this is where we need some leadership from this part of the world, from ASEAN collectively, but individual countries as well. We're not all price takers. These countries have agency. And if you think about the last topic we talked about, de-risking, I think that's what we make it. It's what we make of it. I think until now we've had a really long period where risks have been mitigated and managed under a multilateral rules-based system and with strong domestic laws. Now with a worry about all these new areas where we don't have multilateral rules, and we're trying to build them through bilateral and regional processes, we're worried about these risks in the digital economy and cyber and other areas where if we don't manage these risks collectively and mitigate them, de-risking is going to turn into decoupling big time, and not just between the United States and China, but big fracture down the middle of our region that depends on this the most. So I think some sobering thoughts, but also a call to action for countries to stand up for the multilateral system and actually do something about it, not just the rhetoric. So that's what I take away from this conversation. A lot of issues there and a lot of great questions. Thank you to the audience for staying engaged here, but online as well. And it's up to me finally just to please thank our great panelists for the great discussion and join in me with our applause.